Well, welcome back to the 2021 Adblocker Developer Summit. We've already had a lot of great presentations and we have even more coming up. Presenting next, though, is Brendan Butterworth. Brendan is an independent technology consultant, and his talk today is called Paths to Scalable Trust and Control for Digital Advertising. Brendan, thanks for making some time for us today at the summit. The floor is yours.
Paul, thanks so much for the introduction. I'm looking forward to talking about some of these ideas. I do really appreciate everyone taking the time to listen and hear some of these this thinking about what's going on, and I'll get right into it. When it comes down to it here, I am an independent technology consultant. I've been working in the internet and internet-related technology space for the last 25 years, since the late 90s, doing protocol-level understanding of technology through web analytics and a variety of other spaces there. The premises of this presentation, understanding that the context right now is one of ad blocking, and what I'll be talking about for the next little bit is really about how to establish trust and control in advertising and digital advertising. I did want to start with some basic presentation premises. One is that advertising can make content and services available to people who would not otherwise have access. That that advertising is fundamentally one of many valid transaction points that can be had when we're talking about an exchange of value for content and service access. We also understand that right now there's a really big discussion, literally posted while this session was ongoing. One of my favorite YouTube channels posted a thing about privacy, and so the political, technical, and social discussion about privacy presents really this huge opportunity to think big about how we interact as humans with the internet and all the parties that would love to understand more about us and have different levels of access to things that we haven't thought about historically. So the presentation in a nutshell, we're going to talk about the digital advertising supply chain, do a refresher in that space, think about quality control, how what existing checks and balances are in play, and how those work through that supply chain, and then go into some basics on cryptography, because this is the subject. We're not going deep into blockchain or anything like that, but it will be mentioned, I promise you. And then really go over the paths, some examples of how we could implement and how it could benefit the different participants in the supply chain. So the digital advertising supply chain, when it comes down to it, you can talk about this whole plethora of different participants, from SSPs, DSPs, exchanges, networks, DMPs, CMPs, and a bunch of other three-letter acronyms. But fundamentally, there are buyers, there are sellers, and there's audience. We'll get into those ones. When the way that the buyer, seller, and audience interact is that a seller, the 3 A's type thing, the seller has an audience whose attention they have. A buyer seeks access to that audience by communicating with the seller, and the audience receives ads from the buyer. Money tries to go the other way, where audience is the buyer, whether it be a brand or an agency for a brand, or other abstractions on top of that one, is trying to deliver ads so that they derive revenue, so getting some money that way. The buyers are providing money to sellers so that those sellers can continue providing content and services to the humans, and probably also the bots and browsers or whatever you think on that one. So fundamentally, if you go and take a look at the digital advertising supply chain and the variety of different acronyms that you'll see in that space, the core roles for all the three-letter acronyms are buyer or seller, and then the audience is who we interact with a lot these days. So when you've got this network of interconnected systems that are trying to buy and sell advertisement and deliver them to an audience, whether that audience is willing or not, the question, there are a bunch of questions that the parties have in it. Some of the quick and dirty questions that come up is, well, hey, is this part of a malware campaign? Is it going to impact my users or my reputation when the advertisement gets delivered to users and links to a bad place? Is this brand safe when I'm buying an opportunity to deliver an ad? Is that ad going to be adjacent to content that I don't want my brand to be adjacent to? eyeo has been supportive and participating in the acceptable ads criteria. So does the creative and ad layout meet the criteria that's established by that? And that's something that the client can try to understand. Questions about as a buyer, is this actually the type of audience that I'm looking for? Is it coming from the right site? And there's been some work industry-wide to provide some control in that space. And that gets into who is checking when it comes down to the actual digital advertising supply chain. There's a lot of handing off. There's a lot, even though I simplified it at the beginning, we've got the buyers and we've got the sellers. It goes through party by party, and so you'll have, if you're talking about a large platform, they'll have their own internal verification to make sure that the brand, the advertisement itself matches what's expected and is within the controls. When we talk about the independent systems, there are a bunch of independent verification companies and organizations that will check and attest to the quality and content of advertising payload and context and that type of thing. The Trustworthy Accountability Group is a group that I worked with a few years ago, and they're an industry organization that aims to bring trust and transparency and eliminate fraud from the digital advertising supply chain. And then one of the projects I worked on a while ago is ads.txt, authorized digital sellers. It's an interesting technical method of saying, hey, these are the parties that actually are allowed to sell creative, and these aren't. What you'll notice is these are kind of centralized systems of trust, which we'll get into why there are problems. When you look at the landscape, there are a large number of different companies in the supply chain. You'll have a very large number of websites, very large number of apps, and then those are represented by a significant number of SSPs, sell-side platforms, and aggregations of inventory that way. Those ones will all interact with each other through networks and exchanges. And then you've got the DSPs, the demand-side platform, and it gets to be a mess of spaghetti, even when it comes to companies trying to trust each other and understanding whether a specific ad impression opportunity has been vetted for malware, has been vetted for content adjacency, and all the different checks that we spoke about just before. And now we're also expecting that the users maintain relationships with this entire supply chain. If you've gone and looked at the consent management platforms, they're complex. That set of questions there's work being done to help move the needle and get it so that there's less complication there. But understanding whether I don't have high hopes that my mother, when she's faced with with one of these cookie consent forms, is making informed choices. The complexity of the system just is a bit beyond her, and the granularity isn't where I'd like. So there's some costs in terms of there's a bunch of inefficiencies in the space there. So let's take a little detour and talk about signed metadata and go into the gist of the thinking here. So cryptography, just to bring everybody up to the base level, there's two core concepts. One is encryption and one is signing. Encryption is taking a payload, wrapping it up in a way that nobody else can read it, and sending it to the intended recipient, and then that intended recipient having the ability to unwrap it. That's what you do when you want to zip up files on a computer and prevent anybody from accessing it except for those who have the password. That's not as useful in the context that we're talking through at this point. Signing content is saying, hey, anybody else can look at this, but what I'm going to say is that this payload has been put in there by me, and it hasn't changed since I signed it. So there are a bunch of different ways of doing this, but that's a signed content is fundamental to what we're thinking through here. And when it comes to keys and certificates, I won't go into the differences between private and public key encryption, but keys are what makes cryptography happen. Whereas certificates collect information above and beyond the key that also talk about the identity or the origin of the encryption. So we've got public key infrastructure, common concept, and a few examples like OpenSSL, which is simple public key infrastructure, where it's kind of all relatively easy. Easily observable with simple. The site itself is issuing itself a certificate and encrypting the content so that in OpenSSL specifically, the communication can be secure between the client and the server. I know that there's a lot of work going on in the W3C these days about formalizing DIDs, decentralized IDs, as a way of allowing kind of some of the scenarios that we'll talk through in a little bit here. And then obviously the requisite mention of blockchain. When it comes to distributing public keys, a ledger that's immutable is a convenient place to do so. So it's definitely feasible to store public keys on the blockchain if you want to. So I do think that the digital advertising supply chain can benefit and will benefit if there's an adoption of cryptography in the form of certificates that allow parties to attest to certain attributes of the advertising payload, context, and other things. So we'll get into those. The buyers could definitely go in and start signing things like the identity of the brand, which would be beneficial to brands so that they can know that, hey, downstream, if it purports to be a Coke ad, it's signed as a Coke ad and nobody's misusing that specific brand. You can get some attestations from the creative shop about the creative attributes. So whether it's animated, whether it's below a certain weight, and include this type of metadata signed with a certificate in the most lightweight add headers, and instead of downloading it all and reviewing there. Scan for malware. One of the things that happens less these days, but has been a consistent problem, is that as creative has passed through the supply chain, through the the hops that it will go through, coordination of whether it's been scanned for certain things doesn't happen, and so it has to be redone, much to everybody's cost and delay. When it comes to sellers, sellers can definitely sign things like aggregated audience insights, make those available to buyers. Can sign verified context. There's the possibility that sellers would go and say, instead of for brand safety in terms of content adjacency, sellers can say, hey, this third party has verified that my context is this, and therefore, if you trust that third party as a seller, you can trust that whatever ads are totally permittable next to it. And then audiences can sign things. This is within the client, and this is definitely an area of pay attention to what is thought about here. The non-bot test reference is to Privacy Pass, an effort to extend bot or not verification. It's a project that exists and takes CAPTCHAs and says, if you do a CAPTCHA once, we'll give you anonymized tokens for 20 times, and so that you don't have to keep going back to it. And potentially segment membership or other things. There's a lot of work being done in the Privacy Sandbox that starts thinking about client-side ownership, and this is what we did in Crumbs as well. Start thinking about what attributes can be associated with a client side, and then delivered into the digital advertising supply chain. So let's get into the final path here. How can we use trustable data? And I'm going to take a look at it from the different perspectives, from the seller's perspectives, from the buyer's perspective, and from the audience side of things. So when you've got a buyer interacting with the supply chain, you'd expect a few things. First off, that the buyer would expect that the seller sign, hey, this is where it came from, whether it was a specific app, specific website, specific company. You would expect that the seller be able to attest to its origin. The buyer could also expect that classification engines would pre-classify the seller's content down to the URL level, potentially, because you're not having to scan things. And that has some positive privacy implications in terms of knowing that an ad was delivered against certain content types without knowing the specific URL at prior to delivery time. And then the buyer might expect the seller to transport signed attestations from the client, like that it's not a bot, and potentially other things in a way that could be verified. Obviously, that's got some privacy implications. Then when it comes to a seller interacting with such an ecosystem, seller would, and again, sellers are publishers, content providers, service providers. So they're going to make sure that the right brand is coming through, and the right types of brands, so that if there's any exclusivities that are going on there, and also check the reputation of the payload coming through, so that you can actually fine tune what's allowed in terms of advertising behaviors. And we'll go into from the client side. This really gets some interesting scenarios. If you imagine a digital supply chain that has a lot of signed metadata that's floating about, the client can make decisions prior to ad rendering. Now, it's not a full block, but it's a lightweight decision about whether to load a payload, depending on brand, depending on ad safety, depending on other aspects of the advertising experience. The client can have much more fine-grained control over what type of advertising experience gets delivered. But this whole set of ideas is no simple change. There's a great opportunity, as I started out with, a great opportunity to think big about ways that the digital advertising supply chain can change. But my experience is that consensus is really, really hard. So coming to consensus about metadata, schema, inclusion of this type of data in existing specs, transporting it, getting all of that through the supply chain is going to be very, very challenging and require buy-in extensively. And then this is a new idea that doesn't have any immediately clear impact on the bottom line, other than potentially being a business risk, or a risk to delivering things. So not only are there technical challenges to implementation, but there's less of a, hey, here's an easy way of making more money. There isn't a clear story there. But as owners of clients, owners of or representatives of the user's preference, there are really strong reasons to go ahead with trying to move forward on some of these ideas, and that's that if there is a cleaner, more efficient supply chain, there are plenty of opportunities for a better user experience. Whether that's enhanced user control, so that instead of just yes or no to advertisements, or we trust that this single third party is making sure that only acceptable ads are coming through. There's fine-grained control, allowing classes of advertisement to come through and be verified at impression time instead of a manual process. There's more money going to the parties that are doing the right thing, and less money going to the systems that aren't, and new opportunities for verification and classification systems, where they're not having to just work with the people who touch the creative or the content right in there, but have greater opportunities throughout the thing. So thank you for listening to my crazy ideas. I'm hoping that this spurs some thinking throughout your next few weeks or months or years, and really would love to handle some questions if they do come up.
Well, you're in luck then, Brendan. We have at least a couple. Let's begin with the question that Sophia Lindberg asked in the chat. Sophia is wondering, how would the ad tech and the ad blocking communities need to adjust their approaches to adjust to this shifting landscape?
Yeah, and that is a very interesting one, because it is a real significant shift in thinking from I need to have a business relationship with the parties that are establishing the trustworthy signals through the supply chain, to I can trust technology to do it. And I think that's the most important thing to shift, and that's a conversation that's happening in W3C context and industry wide, like how do we move from trust that depends on sitting down to dinner and shaking hands and business processes to one that says we can actually depend on technology to verify that the trust is there.
Yeah, we've got another one that's coming here internally to me. So out of the different proposals that are around at the moment, Google's Flock, Swan, Parakeet, I think there's one called Turtle Dove. These all seem to be named after our feathered friends in the avian world. Which do you think is the most likely to win out in the end?
That's a really difficult question, and what I hope to see is hybrids form. And I think that it is really important that some mechanism for client-mediated advertising experience, one or more actually come to market, because if they don't, there's this vacuum that forms where mid-sized publishers just don't have access to a similar set of data as they do now, and that motivates this migration to walled gardens and subscription models, which is a net negative on user privacy across the internet. So I think that there's a variety of systems shaking out right now, and when it comes down to it, anything we can do to motivate solutions that are open, accessible, and serve user interests is, even if it's a bit of a trade-off in terms of you're not going to get absolute privacy and still receive some advertising, but hope that something meaningful gets established.
Well, I think we'll all be watching this space. Thanks, Brendan, for joining us and for taking some time to answer these questions. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.